also. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, all good things. We'll start sharing my screen. And if I could get a thumbs up that you see it. Awesome, thank you. Good. All right, so I am delighted to be here today. I'll plan to take maybe just about 25 or 30 minutes for the actual content. As you have questions, please let me know. I'll try to do my best to look over. I've got two monitors, so I have to see chat messages on a different screen here. So I'll try to do my best to look on the other side every now and again. But worst case, since I'll just try to take about 25 or 30 minutes, happy to engage in active discussion shortly after that. So as Brian mentioned, part of the ask today was to focus on robotic process automation. For those of you not familiar with IMA, we support management accountants, that's accounting and financial professionals operating within business as opposed to the external view from a public accountancy perspective. So we do that across the globe and engage our members regularly with regard to the different skills that they will need. So the development from a technological perspective. And so I'll speak to my background and how that's relevant in a second. But what I want to cover today is first just demystify robotic process automation just a bit for a few minutes in the beginning, so we're all starting on the same playing field. And then we'll shift gears into the impact of RPA on accountancy, and then accountancy professionals, specifically the roles that we are playing within our organizations, how we are serving as RPA enablers or taking on different roles within an RPA implementation. And I'll go back just a slide. There's a website that you'll see at the bottom. It'll come back again on the back end at myima.org/RPA. Anyone can access that. And there's a host of RPA resources that are available there. A statement on management accounting that's available, as well as free courseware for any IMA members, and a host of other tools and resources as well. So as Brian said, I'm Loreal Jiles. I am Vice President of Research and Thought Leadership at IMA. I joined IMA about a year and a half ago as Director of Research for Digital Technology and Finance Transformation. And that was following about 15 years in industry. I worked in the energy industry at BP, British Petroleum, and I worked in a host of finance, accounting, management accounting roles in the very traditional sense, financial reporting manager and the like. And so I did a lot of the profitability analysis, gross margin analysis for our trading business, derivatives accounting, et cetera. And that ultimately, I'd say, segued into me developing a passion for digital technology and the impact that it can have on accounting processes at the end of the day. And so, forgive me, the 5-year-old is walking up now, asking me to open a pack of Capri Sun. This is the world we live in today. So carrying on here, the other piece of that, toward the back end of my career at BP, I focused on digital technology implementation, and the last role that I had at BP was standing up the robotic process automation and artificial intelligence program for the finance function within upstream. And so that's a few thousand people across the globe just within that specific finance function, and ultimately served in a bit of an ambassador role, an RPA ambassador role, to help the other finance functions within the organization stand up RPA as well. As part of that initiative, I also wrote the governance framework for RPA at BP, specific to finance implementation. So we'll talk a little bit more about governance and controls and that piece of it as it relates to accountants as well. So we'll get started here. A few kind of just introductory remarks to set the stage. In 2019, the IBM Institute for Business Value published a report, The Enterprise Guide to Closing the Skills Gap. And in that report, they indicated a staggering 120 million workers in the world's 12 largest economies may need to be retrained or reskilled in the next 3 years as a result of intelligent or AI-enabled automation. And I always like to call that out in the earlier stages of tech conversations, because to me, it sets the stage for what we've known has been underway for quite some time. And what was astonishing to me is how ill-prepared executives believe their countries and their businesses are to offer the development that millions of workers will require. And that's a lot of the reason I wanted to focus on digital technology research, because most accountants don't understand how digital technology could truly serve as an enabler of the work that we need to do. As CFOs, controllers, partners of CPA firms are implementing their plans to prepare their teams for the future, accountancy professionals are under pressure to enhance the value offering, to reduce costs, to acquire new skills, and emerging digital technologies are providing the accountancy function with a path toward fulfilling these objectives while meeting business demand for advanced analytics, efficient operations, strategic decision support. And when we think about RPA specifically, it's presenting a clear and what I'd say a sustainable avenue for the transformed accountancy function. At the end of the day, it serves as one of those low barrier to entry technologies that organizations can start with. In a joint survey of finance and accounting professionals conducted by IMA and Deloitte just a couple of years ago, we examined the workforce of the future and how it will be shaped by technology, talent, and automation. Nearly 76% of respondents felt their accounting processes were less than 75% automated. And I think that's important to call out because of the power that currently exists within existing capability of digital technology. We shouldn't have a world where there's 80 or 90% of our processes that aren't automated yet. When asked how we're expecting the type of work within finance to change, more than 90% of respondents indicated they feel the level of transactional processing will either somewhat or significantly decrease and become more analytical over the next 5 years. And I think that's also an important baseline as we start kind of demystifying the technology, because it speaks to what our outlook is and what the current capability of the technology is today, as well as where we think we should be. So it doesn't necessarily say everything that we do today should be automated, but it speaks to if there are processes that we're performing today that could be automated, why aren't they? And so introduce robotic process automation. It's effectively digital technology that's enabling a virtual robot or a bot or a digital worker to emulate human interaction with computer applications to execute processes. And so when we think about what that means from a practical matter, it's a virtual execution engine. And that's, mimicking, I'd say, the clicks and the keystrokes of a human user. And that's happening through the user interface of the application. So oftentimes, historically, when we wanted to automate processes from an accounting perspective, we would do that through the back end of the application of SAP, as he was speaking about just a few minutes ago, for example. And we would reach out to our IT organization, the IT, we give them requirements, they take it away for some weeks or some months or so, and start working on the automation, start working on enhancing the system that we're working in. And the world that RPA introduces is, one, it says, actually, you can automate that process yourself in all likelihood. And so that's one piece of this. And as we talk about operating models in a few minutes or so, we'll talk about what that looks like from a practical perspective. But it says, even if your operating model doesn't lend toward the end user automating themselves and it's centrally held, then what you also have is the opportunity to say, I know enough about this software to inform what's possible, to inform what we can do. And if I have my subject matter expertise from a process perspective, then I can translate that into designing controls throughout the development process, throughout the design process for the automation solution that's implemented. One technical point I like to call out, although it's tempting to say and is widely said, we are not developing bots. We are developing processes that bots will perform. And so I like to call that out just as a point of clarity. We often talk about how many bots did you develop? It's how many bots do you have in production that are operating, but they're performing a certain number of processes that are historically performed by humans. As we take that a step further and just confirm what we know about the capability and the software, bots can log into and perform tasks in accounting and operational applications. We'll talk about some use cases in a couple slides. Retrieve data from websites, perform data entry, generate reports, read PDF documents, send emails, a host of things, generate reports, save those reports in a certain location, send you a notification that it's ready. And all of that can happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. There's the concept of attended automation and unattended automation. And attended automation means someone is there and you're clicking, kick off this process. You want the bot to click off that process right then. But what also happens, which is what we led within our organization at the time, was unattended automation, which is where it's running on a schedule. Every workday 3, I want to generate this report at this time, and I want it to be saved in this place. And it'll do that by pulling data from 3 different sources and collating that together. It might also perform initial analysis and generate a few prompts for you to look at, for the end user to look at. If it's an AP report, perhaps it's calling out certain vendors that require additional investigation, specific invoices, et cetera. Intelligent RPA, I like to speak to because traditional RPA, I view strongly, has a shelf life. and people don't talk about this piece of it transparently. But the reason traditional RPA, which is RPA without any artificial intelligence at all, is beneficial, is it's most beneficial when you're pulling data from multiple sources that doesn't exist in the same place. If you're in an end state, a transformed state from a digital perspective, where you have a data lake or a data warehouse, and all of the data, the financial and the non-financial data, is in the same place, and there's a sleek user interface that's in the front of that people can access, barring any restrictions that are appropriate. In that world, you don't have a strong business case for RPA. Unfortunately, most of our organizations have not attained unto that state. And so that's why RPA is so incredibly important today from a traditional perspective. But if we get to a point where we've truly achieved digital transformation, where we have a data lake or a data warehouse or the like, where all the data is housed in the right place and there's a sleek user interface on the front end, then you don't have a strong use case for traditional RPA. And the long-term view for RPA is intelligent RPA, or IPA as they call it, intelligent process automation. And so I like to speak to that as well, because RPA is going to have the greatest impact, I'd say, within the next few years or so. But as we continue to progress along our digital transformation journeys, the true risk, if I could call it out that way, from an ethics perspective, from a bias perspective, is intelligent process automation, which is the path that we're headed down. And all of the leading RPA vendors, UiPath, Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, already have native solutions that offer intelligent capabilities. There are just, most users just haven't progressed to being able to leverage that truly at this stage, but the technology is there. And as accountants, we need to be thinking about, how do we manage that? How do we mitigate that risk? What governance do we need to have in place to account for that as well? The software side of it, for all leading software vendors, there are three primary components: the bot manager, and the workflow design module. And I call this out so that we're thinking, as we think about the types of controls we might need to have, the way that things are drawn out in today's world, it's important to understand what the makeup of the software is. The bots are performing the processes, as we mentioned a slide or two ago. The bot manager enables scheduling and allocation of developed processes. And the workflow design module is where the processes are developed. So your RPA developer will spend the bulk of their time in the workflow design module, be it an accountant or someone else, a technical person. When we think about the bot manager, that's where the encrypted vault is housed that holds all the credentials, the bot credentials. And that's something that comes up from an audit perspective. How do we ensure that those credentials are managed appropriately? How do we mitigate risk of someone manipulating the outputs? And how is that managed through the software's current capabilities? How is the software itself mitigating some of the risks that may exist from a human perspective? The last piece I'll cover for the software side of things is it's important to call out that leading RPA vendors have also invested heavily in developing native solutions available within their workflow design modules. And they're partnering with other leading technology companies to offer a host of integrating technologies that raise the level of complexity of processes that can be automated with RPA, while enhancing the comprehensive value that RPA is able to deliver. And that's where we talk about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. You're able to have bots kick off a sophisticated algorithms that your IT department is developing as well. And things to recognize is there are natural built-in integrating opportunities for data visualization tools. Lots of RPA softwares already have connectors to Power BI, to Tableau, built into the software. So how are you accounting for that from a control perspective? How do you ensure that the data that RPA is feeding, in all likelihood, behind the scenes, if there's not an automatic connector, how are you ensuring that the right controls are in place for that? Data analytics, you can, again, leverage algorithms or other things that are existing within your broader digital platform or your digital landscape. Optical character recognition is quite popular when we're processing invoices in particular, or using natural language processing to read through some of the email text or language that we see on a website. Then in those scenarios, all of that is happening within the platform in many instances today. Or it's connecting natural connectors that are built in to specific softwares that are available. Most of your leading software is already connecting to the RPA platform. And so I think it's important to call that out from a structural perspective. So that's all the baseline material I wanted to cover for RPA itself, what the technology can do, what the capability looks like, and we'll shift gears now into the impact on accountancy. So automation, generally speaking, is having a wide-reaching impact on the workforce. Bloomberg developed a tool simulating the chances of jobs across a host of professions being impacted by automation. It combined wage and education requirements data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics with data on probability of automation from a document called The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization. And with Bloomberg simulation, accountant and auditor jobs are 94% likely to be impacted by automation. Another noteworthy observation from that report is that accountant and auditor jobs are among fewer than 10 professions requiring a bachelor's degree that are more than 90% likely to be impacted by automation. And so I think that's important to call out because it speaks to, one, what's expected, but also what we're starting to experience as we progress along our finance transformation, accounting transformation, broader digital transformation journeys. The last piece, as we think ahead, we conducted a survey last year, and this was about 1,500 respondents here on the expected impact of emerging technologies in the next 3 years, what technology was believed will have the greatest impact on the finance and accounting profession within the next 3 years. And a third of those respondents said robotic process automation. And I think that's also just important to call out the others that we see there, naturally, artificial intelligence, data science, the analytics world, and then budgeting, planning, and forecasting tools, but all some sort of extension of the same fundamentals there. And so now we'll talk a little bit about use cases. So we'll use this pyramid. I developed this pyramid using some of the research that McKinsey has done, some of what Bloomberg has done as well, and then research that we've done for what specific accounting processes exist today. What's in our current landscape of how we're operating. And so McKinsey conducted a detailed analysis of finance and accounting processes and automation software capability. And they found the capability of automation tools that existed in 2018 could fully automate 42% of finance and accounting activities and mostly automate a further 19%. The figure on the screen, I designed to combine a summary of finance and accounting tasks evaluated in that study with other common finance and accounting activities that we heard from our membership to present relative complexity of process areas and the relative likelihood of being automated. So we wanted to draw that correlation out. The figure demonstrates the correlation between process complexity and automation likelihood, highlighting processes traditionally performed by entry-level accounting and finance staff or individual contributors as those most likely to be automated. These are processes like journal entries and routine close activities, accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, reconciliation, cash disbursement. As the relative complexity of the task increases, so the higher you go up the pyramid, the automation likelihood reduces for current technological capabilities. McKinsey's findings underscore what's been seen in implementations of organizations commencing RPA journeys over the past few years. And as we think about RPA software vendors, they've transparently shared that most enterprises, regardless of industry, begin their RPA journeys in the finance and accounting department. That data is, I'd say, no more than a year and a half, 2 years old, and it was over 80% of the RPA journeys that start in organizations start with finance and accounting processes. This will touch us. And I think it's important for us to tackle it head on. And there's a couple of opportunities here. There's one, if we don't tackle it head on, then our IT departments will attempt to automate our processes on our behalf with a bit of our engagement. The other side of this is accountancy can lead in that space, can lead in determining what future we will have from a technological perspective. Of greatest impact, again, some of those processes that you see toward the bottom of the pyramid there, as we think about accountants working in organizations who have made progress along their RPA journeys, they're operating in an environment with what I called human and digital coworkers. So the team that I led, I very much viewed it as having human team members and digital team members. The digital team members were accountable for delivering certain tasks, and I had to oversee those tasks in a similar manner that I would manage and oversee those tasks performed by a human worker. And I think we need to embrace that mindset because then it shifts the narrative. It shifts our perspective from an ethics perspective. What do we need to think about? You're not necessarily in this scenario, if you're using traditional RPA, thinking about the judgment side of it from an ethics perspective, not for the digital worker. But then you have to move it upstream to say there are inputs to that process that come from a human. And so what ethical considerations might we need to keep in mind for how the inputs to those processes performed by digital workers could be manipulated, for how the various control checkpoints that we have along the digital process where a human is stepping in, how might they need to consider what judgments are required in that scenario. As we step into the space where we're leveraging intelligent process automation, then there's a conversation about the typical things that we hear for how bias might influence the algorithms, for how the bias of the programmer themselves might influence the output. And so just as we're designing controls to account for that, we built in controls in our scenario when we were implementing, we built in controls in the way that the development happens. So we prepared mandatory controls that were required from a development perspective. And I think that piece of governance is incredibly important as we think about what things will look like in the future. The next piece here, before we shift gears into the specific roles that accountants are playing in RPA, I'd say that you see the misconception I call out, RPA will automate all finance and accounting jobs. This is usually the question I'm asked when I have this conversation with hundreds or thousands of accountants. And they're saying, well, why should we want to be on the front end of this? And I think for me, we need to think about it as the opportunity and as an opportunity where we've already managed governance, where we've already managed compliance and controls. This is the same type of opportunity, and it's an opportunity to control our future, if you will. It's definitely a viable automation solution for a lot of the processes that, for what it's worth, we historically thought were untouchable. There were a lot of instances in the earlier days of me trying to implement RPA where people said, your bot can't do that. Your digital worker can't handle this. I've been doing this for 20 years, and it actually can in many instances. And so there's one world where, of course, for traditional RPA, there are some limitations with what can happen. But to the extent that we're embracing intelligent process automation, a lot more is in the art of the possible. The other piece that I'll speak to here is RPA is producing a more valuable service for the organization. It's transforming the way that we deliver value, shifting gears into that value creation mode. So the piece I'll cover lastly is accountancy professionals, the roles that we're actually playing. So within the team that I led, I had accountants as well as technical folk. So people with IT or computer science backgrounds. They worked on the same team together, and they had similar expectations. We also stood up a development program, and that capability development program was to bring accountants up to speed on RPA. There are a few different roles that we'll talk about that they can play. Some of that's in the analyst role, where they call it a BA, a business analyst role, where you're able to say, what does the next step look like for me? What does the process look like in today's world, and how might we apply that down the line? And then there's another world where accountants become RPA developers, which is the path that I decided to take, because I felt that I needed to learn how to do that to be able to effectively lead the program and speak the language, not just of the accountants, but also of the digital workers, and then of the technical workers that were on my team. And so what I'd say is one of the most common instances where we have accountants playing a role in RPA implementations is in implementing governance. And so this was my first step. I took about 3 or 4 weeks or so when I started the role and tried to survey the land, if you will, to find out what information exists, what guiding principles, what best practices exist. And at the time, they didn't exist. And this is despite engagement with a host of leading accountancy organizations, with the firms, with the Big Four, with others, and having those conversations with very captive audiences. Even in that scenario, we could not find overarching guidance for how we should govern RPA from an accountancy perspective. And that was problematic for me, because the controller I reported to at the time was saying, I still need to be able to provide assurance. I don't care that this is a digital worker that's performing the process. How will you confirm for me that I can provide the same level of assurance that I provided when it was a human performing the task? And we had to account for that. There were different considerations we had to think through. And so that took, translated into writing a 70-page governance document for that specific initiative, but it speaks to, in an overarching manner, how should we be approaching RPA or other digital technology implementations. And so I call out here, and Deloitte pulled together 5 key risk areas a couple years back, specific to RPA implementation. And those were operational, financial, regulatory, organizational, and technology. And I pulled in some examples into this table here of what some of those risks might look like. The one I'll call out from a regulatory perspective, humans directing bot activities in a fraudulent manner. That's something I think that it will affect how we design controls in the future, will affect how our internal audit and our external auditors are looking at our processes as well, beyond the actual process itself. Upstream of that, how are the inputs being influenced? When we think about technology, it speaks to some of the standards that we establish from a development perspective. We establish development standards, and that'll be in a couple of slides or so here. From an operational perspective, also insufficient exception handling. We automate for the best case scenario and don't account for the other scenarios that are natural for the human thought process, but would not be natural for a digital worker's process. We think about the financial side, what's the risk of financial misstatement? We ended up categorizing the types of processes that we would automate in that process to determine which ones we would prioritize. And we said, if there's something that could touch the financial statement, then we need to apply a different level of rigor, a different level of control focus, if it's something that could translate into financial misstatement. There were other processes that were more in the back end, more on the internal management side, more on the analysis side, that didn't rise to the level of being able to translate into financial misstatements. And so we treated those processes slightly different. And we worked with our internal control function as well as with the internal audit function to identify what might they be looking for, what would allow them to provide assurance ultimately. And we did that on the front end as we were designing the standards for this. The ethics lens, I think, here, as we're thinking proactively about risk mitigation, is one, we need to have that conversation about how do we ensure, one, that the bias is not present if we're using intelligent process automation, how do we ensure there's fair processing, how do we ensure that we're not missing something at the end of the day. And then I think the other side of that, thinking about the differences in digital workers and human workers, and what considerations we need to think about for that perspective. Those were the risk areas. I conducted about 60 interviews to prepare this particular piece of research, and that was amongst the Big Four, amongst a few other top firms, amongst each of the leading RPA firms, and then amongst a host of others. And we came to 5 prerequisites for effective bot governance. And so I won't go through this in detail, but it speaks to, if accountants are standing up this process, what does best practice look like for how they begin to establish governance, identifying key stakeholders, determining the RPA operating model, conducting a proof of concept. Is this even the right technology for us? Before we go too far down the line, it may not be the right technology for the types of processes or the maturity of the processes that are in place. Performing process discovery, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, and then preparing a business case. So that's my recommendation for before you ever get to establishing governance. But once you're there, then these 7 components I found throughout each of the firms, as well as the other organizations from an operational perspective that were implementing governance. And so they needed to have governing bodies. In many instances, an accounting function implementation, your governing body it'll be 2 roles. You'll have some sort of steering committee, some sort of governance committee or governance board, and that's usually your most senior finance or accounting leader, your controller, your CFO. And then we also had representatives from the internal control function, from the internal audit function, and we proactively engaged the external auditor to let them know we're planning to stand up this digital initiative. We're planning to do it in this manner. Are there additional considerations we need to think through? And that's the admonishment generally for best practices across accountancy implementation. Organizational constructs, what would the operating model look like? Internal controls, operational life cycle. We defined the life cycle that a process goes through from ideation to implementation and maintenance ultimately. and there have to be the right controls, internal controls, technology standards from a development perspective, and performance management at each of those stages along the life cycle. And then the vendor management part is incredibly important, which isn't as big of a deal in some scenarios, but as we think about the ERP, there's active vendor management with SAP, for example, if that's the ERP that's being used in the organization. The same thing needs to happen for the RPA vendor that's selected for the other vendors. If you're using a different organization for the optical character recognition, for OCR, you need to have vendor management for that as well. Automating the right processes, these are roles that accountants are playing today. So first, the governance role is one of the most important roles. The second piece is on selection of processes. I won't go through this in too much detail. There are three fundamental operating models that are typically chosen: a centralized model, a decentralized model, and a federated model. And that essentially says, well, you have a central team, they call them a robotic operations center or a center of expertise, a COE. Will they handle all of the development and the governance, or will they go beyond that and decentralize it to enable the people that are the end users to do this? From a federated perspective, will they go even a step further to say we have citizen development, which means literally just about anyone that's an end user can develop and is given a license, a bot license to develop. And that's something I'll share a use case there. PwC made the decision to go federated in part of their organization. They issued hundreds of these bot developer licenses to a lot of their new hires a couple years back and empowered them to say, tell us how we should be automating the processes that we're leveraging. That still requires a certain amount of governance. It still requires a certain amount of prioritization criteria for what processes we will allow people to automate. Filling the hopper with ideas, that piece, you can have a bottom-up, a top-down approach, as well as inspired by problems or audit and analytical findings is usually one of the key drivers. So as you identify, in many instances, user error, human error that influence some of these missed opportunities, and a lot of times we had processes entered into the hopper that were expressly designed to mitigate risks that we identified through the audit or the analytical process. And you'll have instances where you have grassroots ideation initiatives. You'll have sessions where people are generating ideas. We had web-based platforms where accountants were able to submit their ideas into a web-based tool, and then we prioritize those according to that. The top-down, of course, leadership informing what processes would be automated. Here are two fundamental questions we ask at the end of the day: can we automate, and should we automate? And there's an ethics lens to this as well, because there are some processes that you need to decide, no, it's not appropriate for us to automate this, or which technology would we use, or which component of the process is appropriate to be automated, and do we need to leave a different component of the process for a host of reasons to a human? And so those two fundamental questions accountants are asking and answering in today's world. And lastly, I use this slide to speak to what the RPA program typically looks like. And in this scenario, you'll see in the dark blue box in the center there, RPA program team, the product owner. I served in the role of product owner, and you'll see that within the accountant and finance function implementation, usually an accountant is the one that's serving in the role of the product owner. That's close to the business. It's someone that needs to understand what's truly valuable to the function. And that happens, I'd say, in maybe 80–90% of instances. The best implementations, there's someone from the business, they call it, or someone from that function that's serving in the role of product owner. Also, other roles that accountants are filling today, the business analyst role that you see, the BA role, which is where we're identifying those processes. We are mapping the existing processes and designing controls that will be accounted for in the development of the process. RPA developers, some accountants are going that route to become RPA developers. Solution architect is more focused on the design of the process itself. The roles that I have in yellow are typically filled by technical folks, so by IT people or people with computer science backgrounds. Not as typical that accountants are in those roles, but all the other roles that you see there, accountants are filling those roles in business today as well as in firms. The governing board and the steering committee lens that we spoke about a little bit earlier, the governing board usually more senior, the the ultimate decision maker within the accounting function, as well as their leadership team in many instances and the lead IT rep for that part of the business. The steering committee, usually a layer down, where you've got the people that manage controls on a daily basis. You've got your financial reporting team leads or your account payable managers, et cetera. And then the step beneath that, as you see below there, the stakeholders, subject matter experts, business process owners, which would be people who are most knowledgeable and closest to the processes themselves. Perhaps they develop the standard operating procedures. Perhaps they work to design the controls that are currently in place and would be best positioned to lend advisement on what the controls should look like in the digital world, the internal and external audit world, internal control, et cetera. And so that's the bulk of what I wanted to cover. I'm hopeful that that was helpful. We kind of started with a bit of a foundation there on the technology itself, shifted into how it's impacting accountancy and then the roles that accountants are currently playing. So I will stop sharing my screen and invite anyone to actively discuss if there are questions or considerations you want to talk through.
Yeah, thanks so much, Loreal. I think that was incredibly valuable. The real value that I get out of that is the clear depth of experience and the very practical implementation issues that you raise, and sort of where these this particular form of technology, I know it's sort of a basket of technologies, but we'll kind of lump it together, how that's being implemented. I think it's extremely useful, because that's what gets us thinking about how are professional accountants going to interface with this issue, right? In terms, and we see it everywhere, right? Development, they could be there, they could be on the implementation side, and they can certainly be on the use side as well.
Yep.
Will be. Or they'll be replaced by the use side.
There's that, if they decide not to upskill.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Yeah, questions, please. I'll jump in because I've got a question, and then I'm sure there's going to be other questions.
Yeah, looks like Sandeep was coming off too, so we'll go to him next. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, there's not a shy group for sure. Just a really quick sort of little bit of background context question. So you were talking about the move from RPA to IPA. I'm wondering what you're seeing being built into RPA that is going to call it IPA. And where I'm coming at this from is, you think of artificial intelligence, and there's a multitude of different definitions of what gets encompassed in that. So obviously the I within that tends to be what people always say, well, is this intelligent or not intelligent? So when you're referring to that, what might be included there?
Yep. So I'll give a couple of examples. The first one that comes to mind is one of the software vendors called Automation Anywhere has something they call IQ bots. And what we see as one of the most traditional RPA use cases is invoice processing. And that's usually for mid-sized enterprises. Large enterprises usually have straight-through processing already of some sort, or it's for exception handling of large enterprises. But invoice processing is one of the most common RPA use cases for accountants. And the piece where the I would come in there. So imagine a world where the bot is going to, using character recognition, to go read the invoice, read this PDF document, which might be in 12 different languages, which is the scenario we had. Multiple languages, multiple currencies, different value add tax that's there or not there because they forgot to put it on the invoice. And so the bot is going to recognize, and it's reading to say, what data do I need to extract, given these invoices will be in different formats, given they'll be in different languages, et cetera. And so that's one piece of it that in large part can be handled with traditional RPA. Where IPA would come in is, how do we improve the accuracy of the processing of these invoices by the digital worker? And so what you do when you're processing transactions, whether it's journal entries or other types of transactions, RPA is saying, I want to get a score. So I mandated, we need to get a score that says, how confident is the bot that this is accurate? And that's based on a host of things, the clarity of the image that it's trying to recognize characters from. It's based on if we already had that language going through some of the testing scenarios, et cetera. And it'll give us a score. And if it gives me a score below a certain threshold, maybe 90-something%, then I would say it needs to be flagged. What IPA will allow us to do is, as we go to check those that are flagged and say, actually, this was inaccurate, here's what the right answer should have been, RPA takes our indication that it's inaccurate and applies that to be able to process more accurately in the future, to be able to recognize characters more accurately in the future. And so that's one scenario for a common use case. The other side of that, I would say, is on the forecasting side. And so a lot of what we do on the budgetary side, the forecasting, the planning, and analyzing financial statements is leveraging artificial intelligence. In some instances, you could do that in a basic sense with traditional RPA, where you have it create pivot tables or have it, effectively filter and sort data, but that doesn't require intelligence. The intelligence side comes in where you have algorithms that are able to go and identify what trends have we seen, pulling that data from other external sources, market sources in some instances, and then applying those learnings in a genuine sense to the forecast, to what came out of the financial statements that were analyzed, and then recommending, in a very literal sense, here are the changes that we might want to make from an operational perspective. So 2 examples there on the IPA side as it takes us a step beyond the traditional world.
Helpful, yeah, thanks. Sort of trying to automate some of the at least lower level judgments that are involved in decision making.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sandeep?
Thanks, Roy. That was really a great presentation. I think it's very clear in terms of how the RPA works and the transition to IPA. My question's around small and medium enterprises and their capacity to make use of this particular technology.
Yes.
And I guess part 2 of that is that it is likely that they're going to need help from essentially what will be their trusted advisor, which is a firm of auditors, and the potential conflict that may ensue. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of how that can be managed.
I have lots of thoughts on this. So many thoughts that I'm in an executive doctorate program, and that is my topic, Sandeep.
When you've come to the conclusion, we'll be more than happy to receive.
Absolutely. No, so it's expressly almost what you described as digital transformation of small and mid-sized enterprise accounting leaders, and how they're able to enable digital transformation, how they select the technologies, how they are even able, because they have limited resources and unique challenges, how they're able to progress that. So that is my topic. So I'll have an answer for you in about 2 years. But on the more practical side for what we see today, for RPA, there's 2 challenges that we face. The piece you spoke to is the second challenge. The first challenge that we have is most RPA firms do not target small and mid-sized enterprises, period. They target large enterprises. So in many instances, one, the leaders of SMEs don't even have access to this technology, don't know that people are implementing the technology, ... And that's largely because the strategy of RPA vendors is to approach large enterprises. And it's not a knock, so to speak, and it doesn't mean that they don't support small and mid-sized enterprises. But from a commercial perspective, think about selling 2,000 box licenses to one large enterprise or working with 400 small and mid-sized enterprises to get the same amount. And so from a practical perspective, most of the energy, most of the organizations that have even adopted RPA are large enterprises. So there's very little experience in the small and mid-sized enterprise world. And so then that shifts gears to your second point about where do we get those resources? How do we get that support if we are accountancy leaders in the small and mid-sized enterprises? And I think it's in 2 places. When I think about the large enterprise view, there's actually a knowledge gap, in my opinion, based on these 60 interviews that included several of, I'll say, the top 10 largest accountancy firms. And what I found was on the audit side of those firms, they actually don't have the depth of expertise from an RPA perspective. The depth of expertise sits on the advisory side. And as you'll be aware, in many instances, the advisory and the audit side don't talk within those enterprises. And so that's a missed opportunity. There are some instances where it makes sense for them not to talk, but there are other instances where from a technical perspective, that knowledge could be shared. And a tangible example of this, which I think I talked about with Brian, we received guidance from one of the larger audit firms that you need to ensure that you treat segregation of duties the same way with a digital worker that you do with a human worker. What we learned from a technical perspective is it's actually not necessary. If you understand how the technology physically works, how it mechanically works, then it's not necessary to have the same segregation of duties requirements for a digital worker as you do for a human worker. And on the advisory side of the shop, same organization, they understand this concept because they're closer to the capability of the tool, closer to implementations on the ground. On the audit side, that understanding is not there and it's not unique to one organization. So that's maybe, 18 months old or so. Hopefully we've progressed since then, but I'm not terribly optimistic that that school of thought has progressed significantly. And so I think that support then, one, needs to come from the accountancy organizations, the accountancy function within the firm, from organizations like IMA and other professional accountancy bodies that are standing up that expertise. We have a responsibility to ensure that our members are well-versed enough or have access to the resources to be able to make those decisions as well. And so I think ideally it comes from the audit firm, but I think it's on the front end and not during the actual implementation. So the route we took was engaging them up front and saying what are the overarching principles that we should take into consideration as we design our processes and our framework, which is a slightly different question than advise me on this specific process, which would, to your point, be a conflict of interest.
Thanks. Yeah, there's quite a lot of food for thought in that. And I guess one of the big questions is in terms of that the broader public interest. It sounds as if you're an SME, for you to be able to access technology, which is ultimately going to be of benefit, there is a cost implication which actually acts as a barrier, and therefore, and I guess conversely, are the if you like the ethics framework that we have acting as a barrier and therefore acting against the public interest, because you need to have access to good quality advice to be able to do and have processes that actually add value and benefit.
Yep, I think absolutely. And so I call it being priced out of RPA, which is exactly the first point that you raised, the cost acting as a barrier. There are ways around that, but not really good ways. If you're a small enterprise, mid-sized enterprise can probably shoulder it. The crafty way around that is not buying as many bot licenses. There's fixed costs and variable costs in the implementation. But definitely many SMEs are priced out of RPA in some instances, and that wasn't the case 3 to 5 years ago. But the pricing models have changed. The baseline pricing has changed. Minimum contracts in some instances have been implemented. And then the other piece, I think the other side of that from a resource perspective is what obligation do we have to further develop, to provide the right resources? And when you raise is the ethical component acting as a barrier, I do think that's a factor. I think that as we seek to maintain a certain level of independence, we need to refine our thinking on how we can collaborate, on how we can ensure that we're able to develop the right expertise that's needed within those organizations. And so I think we lean a bit too heavily in some instances on what independence should look like. And as the world continues to evolve, having that advanced digital technology lens would actually improve the audit process itself. And so I think we don't look at that side of it in many instances. Definitely agree.
Some really good points there, and actually follows on with our prior presentation, who spoke in similar terms about that whole weighing out of the public interest issues that come up about what firms might be able to do versus are prohibited from doing, and how to kind of balance that, especially with different size clients, for sure. One of the other barriers that was raised was on the competence side. You'd mentioned in terms of the upskilling, and that's come up a few times. So I know that you've got a robust competency framework for your IMA members that fulfills the requirements of the International Education Standards. Obviously, that's your sort of guidepost for all jurisdictions. I'm wondering the extent to which you're seeing your framework change and adapt to the exponential changes in the technology space, especially given some of the changing role and the on-the-job requirements for professional accountants that we're already seeing, and obviously some of which you articulated well today.
Yep. So thankfully, our competency framework is quite broad. And so what we try to do is just slot things in where deemed appropriate. And to the extent that RPA is relevant there, we have a technology and analytics component of our competency framework for accountants. And under that, thankfully, very broad banner, we include things like RPA, data analytics, data visualization, and the like. And what I'd say I'm more encouraged by than by practitioners adopting this is we've had several accountancy professors incorporate these learning tools into their curriculum. And I think, to me, that's the win as we think ahead about the future of accountancy. We've seen many accountancy professors say, let me get this RPA series and incorporate that into my accounting course and ensure that my students now are starting to develop those skills in today's world. And we see that happening with RPA, with data analytics, so much so that we've even made a lot of these courses free to students so that professors can implement it and incorporate it into their curriculum. And then I think on the professional side, from a practical perspective, what we see from an evolution is what technologies we focus on. And I think that's how it's shifting a bit. There's one aspect of the how we work, and then there's another aspect of the tools that we're using to deliver value. And so the tools, I think, will naturally continue to evolve. The how we work, we've started to focus more on agility. And that is one area where the framework is being evolved as well. How do we bring in things like organizational agility, and what does that mean to the accountancy function? What does it mean to the accountant body from an external and internal view, all of that. And so what we've tried to do now is have practical use cases where we're showing this is how accountants are implementing agile ways of working, and this is how that translates into the technology space. Most digital implementations are being done and led by IT organizations in an agile way. And I'd say that shift in ways of working is more impactful to the framework that we have than the actual tools themselves.
Yeah, makes sense. That makes sense. That's also very much aligned with what we're hearing from a number of different stakeholders on some of the shift, again, that broad, high-level shift toward the essential professional skills that are required. It's not just about technical upskilling, although that's important because you got to speak the same language with the IT folks, but it's around those professional skills as well for helping to manage these processes, projects, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Just on that discussion, and this might be slightly cheeky in the way that I'm going to express it, so apologies in advance. We've talked about digital enabling stuff and having a mindset to accommodate digital and I guess the growth mindset in that context. In terms of when we're looking at standards, and I guess from an IASB perspective, ethical standards, are we still in an analog world as opposed to a digital world?
I think in many cases, perhaps. And so let me qualify the question there. So is it speaking to, is the view or the position we have from an ethics perspective antiquated and therefore not reflective of what we need in today's world? Or is that where you're headed?
Yeah, I think you've articulated better than I have. So
No worries. So I think there are some elements to that. I know that there, and I got a preview of something, so I don't know if this is live or not, but I know that there were changes being made to the code to account for technology in a more explicit way, if I could say it that way. So I remember seeing something on that, but I don't know if that's live or not. But so I think that's one step. But in its current state, I think we are not accounting for expressly, in an explicit manner, the challenges that our profession faces today. And so that's the way I characterize it. I think that we as a professional body, and I'm using that in the collective sense for PAOs in general, We, as a larger collective, need to be more agile. Why is it taking us as long as it is? And we, again, genuinely in the collective, why is it taking us as long as it is to adapt to the challenges that our profession is currently facing? There's an element of, maybe 10 years ago, there was belief that maybe this was a fad, but I think there's wide acceptance now that this is the future. And so in that scenario, I think this gets back to the ways of working affecting the framework and affecting the ethics standards and the code that exists. And to that extent, to me, it's more about how can we, in a more agile way, adapt the code where necessary and it not take what it used to take to make a revision to the code, and balancing that, admittedly, with the obligations and the trickle-down implications to other PAOs, to their need to comply to the code. But I think my short answer there, Sandeep, is absolutely. I think that and it's not just the code, it's the code. It's also what external audit is doing today. We talked about 5 years ago, the world of being able to not have to select samples anymore from an audit perspective. Technology, that capability that existed 5-7 years ago allowed for not needing to select samples, to be able to audit the entire body and scope of the data. And we're still not doing that on a widespread basis. Why? And so it's not just the code. I think it's the profession at large. And we talk about, I can't think what the exact quote is, but there's this quote that speaks to, we always anticipate that technology will have a sooner impact than it will. And then on the back end, we see that it had an effect sooner than we thought. I can't think of the exact quote, but that comes to mind as we thought 5-10 years ago that this would revolutionize things, and it's still very capable of doing that, but we haven't embraced it yet. And so to me, what I want to spend a lot of time on is what are those barriers, to your point, Sandeep, not just for SMEs, but for large enterprises that still haven't progressed to where we could for the current capability of technology.
Interesting. Loreal, can I ask you one specific follow-up question on that code point that you're referring to, and sort of the modernization, if you will, of the code specifically? So we see concepts like explainability and transparency of these sorts of intelligent systems being included in really nearly all of the ethics frameworks related to intelligent processing.
Yep.
What's the extent to you of the importance from an ethics perspective that PAs need to proactively consider and be accountable for those kinds of characteristics when they're involved in developing, implementing, relying on the outputs from such intelligent systems?
Yep. There's this concept of responsible AI, right? And so that's what comes to mind in the question that you're asking. A lady that I know is leading research in the area of leadership of responsible AI. And that's what comes to mind. I think as accountants, we have an ethical obligation. And that obligation is, from a practical perspective, one, to ensure that the kind of classic case of the algorithms that are being designed do not compromise the control environment and do not lead to potential financial misstatements. To me, that's the overarching piece. And what that means tactically is, as we're implementing specific digital technologies, our role as accountants is to ask the questions, to ask, how are we accounting for the bias that may be present in the algorithms? How are we designing controls that include humans in some instances? And so we had certain processes, if they were in a certain category that could touch the financial statement, then we said there must be a human control somewhere in the process. It can't be 100% automated, just the determination we made. And we said that is how, and that human control had to be a professional accountant. And so in those scenarios, I think our responsibility is to ask the right questions. It's not to be experts on artificial intelligence. It's not to be experts on data analytics. It's to ask the right questions grounded in the principles that currently exist in the code for what it's worth. But we have to develop the skill to apply those principles to digital technology. And that's where, to Sandeep's point, I think we're still a little bit antiquated, because I don't know that we're providing enough guidance on how to translate the principles from the code to applying them to digital technologies, to different types of digital technologies and the implementation thereof. And so I think for me, the most important piece is asking the right questions, It's asking, is this the right digital technology for this process? It's asking what we designed a tool that would assess the risk profile of each individual process that we were going to automate. And so someone submitted an opportunity. We had a business case that had to be prepared. We also had a risk profile, and it had to get a risk score, each individual process, before we automated it. And that risk score was informed by whether or not it touched the financial statements, whether or not it influenced decision-making, what ... And those are questions that came from accountants. Accountants said, we need to provide assurance, and how will we do that in today's world with this specific technology? And what we were able to do after we did that for RPA was say, now that we move on to data analytics, how do we ask the same types of questions? And I think that skill will come, one, from the guidance that we as professional accountancy organizations and standard setters that we provide to the profession at large, but also from helping them develop foundational understandings of the digital tools that we're starting to use more and more today.
Totally fits, totally makes sense. So if I can summarize, and correct me if I'm wrong here, what you're saying is there, from a practical perspective, in terms of what you think we should be doing as standard setters, and collectively, obviously, right, because you have a code as well, there should be enough hooks within the code to ensure that whatever additional guidance, and probably the bulk of the guidance should be outside the code, but there really need to be enough hooks in the code so that as a PA, when I pick up the code, I go, okay, I see myself, my situation within the code and within the language, and if I need a bunch more information, I'm probably not going to find it in the code, but I can be referred on to additional guidance somewhere else.
Absolutely. It should automatically translate to me. We should be able to pick up the code and say, and I don't know that the code needs to your point, most of the explicit guidance will be outside the code, but I don't know that it needs to say, list each digital technology. That's not the world we're in. It's more about how do we ask questions? How do we ensure that the processes that we're executing or performing are I'd say fair and unbiased, and the judgment or the output of that still informs decision making, and in the way that we would adhere to the code previously. And so I think that what I'd love to see is an evolution of the code where the principles that you see there, I look at that and I say, I know now my responsibility as an accountant for digital implementation, period. It doesn't have to be specific to certain technologies because technologies will change. 5 years from now, maybe blockchain will have caught on to more people. It's not there yet, across the board, maybe in the financial sector, but and maybe we'll be having that conversation then. So I don't think it needs to be explicit to specific technologies, but we should be able to look at the code and say, how does this apply to digital implementation, period? Because it's a widespread thing and it's not going away.
Right. So you might, and I'm not trying to suggest that this is going to happen or anything else, and I'll just throw out an example, but you might, for example, see in the code, or you might expect to see, as a professional accountant, you ought to, whatever the language is, ask appropriate questions around explainability or transparency or what have you,
Yep.
But you wouldn't expect to see, obviously, the specific questions or specific technology components or what have you, but around the concept, because explainability is a nice high-level principle, or transparency, or all the other ones. So you would say PAs have an obligation to think about those things and ask questions, and that's the extent of the obligation component. And then there can be a whole bunch of guidance that's put out by organizations like yourself and others, and to some extent IFAC and whatnot, to say, by the way, here are some of these sorts of questions that, like specific questions or ideas around that.
Yes, I think there's one more piece though, Brian. I think PAs have an obligation to ask the right questions, but it's also, I think we have an obligation to propose the right mitigation.
Okay.
And so that, I think it's two-pronged in that scenario, and we don't want to get too prescriptive depending on the type of role they're in, but I think once we ask those questions and we hear whatever the response may be, then we have an obligation to propose mitigation that so that we don't compromise the control environment, so that we don't see scenarios where assurance would be called into question, so that we don't see bias affecting the outcomes of the technical process that's performed by a digital worker. And so to your point, examples then could come in other capacities where we start talking about human and digital workers and implementing human controls. So those things we could propose in a separate scenario, but I think it's one, knowing what types of questions to ask, what kind of things we're looking for, and then knowing how to propose mitigations for those scenarios.
And I might scope in the mitigations that we would be expected, or that the public could reasonably expect from us, or our employers or whatnot. That's really scoped in by our competency domains, our specific areas of expertise. Yeah.
Absolutely. Not broadly, but as it relates to our already established competency domain, yes.
Yep. Because we don't want to make this overbroad either and be suddenly responsible for every implementation of IT and everything that's happening in the org.
Absolutely not.
We have plenty to do.
Absolutely.
Even as we get automated away, we'll still have plenty to do in other ways. So.